The afternoon sun filtered through the sheer curtains in the living room, casting a warm golden haze over the space Irene Wallace had kept pristine for decades. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, stirred only by the faint hum of the air purifier in the corner. Everything was in its place just the way Robert liked it, just the way she liked it. She smoothed her hands across the doilies on the side table and straightened the framed photo of her and Ethan. He must have been 6 then, missing his 2 front teeth, holding a fishing pole and grinning from ear to ear. That was before the promotions, the suits, and the woman who now had his full attention. The doorbell rang. A cheerful chime echoed through the hall. Irene's heart gave a quick, polite flutter. She walked slowly, partly from age, partly from nerves. When she opened the door, Ethan was already stepping inside, arms loaded with 2 cardboard boxes. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "We're here." Behind him stood Tara, perfectly composed in a camel trench coat and black ankle boots. Her auburn hair was tied back in a neat twist, and her eyes scanned the entryway like a realtor on inspection. "We made good time," Tara said, glancing at her smartwatch. Traffic wasn't bad. Irene offered a small smile. "Good. Let me help you with those." "Oh no, I got it," Ethan replied quickly, disappearing down the hall with one of the boxes. Tara lingered in the entryway, slowly removing her coat. "It's quaint. Still smells like cinnamon and pine." "I bake sometimes," Irene said, her voice gentle. "Robert always loved those scents." "Right." Tara didn't look at her when she said it. "Well, we won't be here too long. Just a month or 2 while the contractors finish the kitchen reno." Irene nodded, her hands clasped together in front of her. "Of course, you're both welcome." As Tara stepped inside, her sharp heels clicked against the hardwood floors. Her eyes moved quickly from the wallpaper to the family photos, to the vintage love seat with its floral patterns and crocheted cushions. "I'll probably need to set up a workspace somewhere," she said offhandedly. "The dining room might be best. Is that okay?" "It's your home too while you're here," Irene said softly. But something inside her already knew she had just stepped into a new chapter, and this one didn't open gently. That evening, Irene stood by the doorway to her bedroom, the one she had shared with Robert for over 30 years. Inside, Tara was folding her blazers into neat rows in the walk-in closet. A hair straightener hummed quietly on the dresser. Her overnight bag had become a suitcase, then 2. Ethan was adjusting the curtains. Tara gets up early for calls. "Mom, I figured we'd take the master. You can use the guest room. It's cozier." "I see." Irene's eyes drifted to the floral bedspread she had sewn herself the winter after Robert passed. "I'll get your things moved tomorrow," Ethan added, as if discussing a utility bill. "It'll just be temporary." Irene nodded and turned away. That night, she lay in the guest room, smaller, colder, the mattress still stiff from disuse. The ceiling creaked differently. The air didn't smell like cinnamon or pine anymore. She reached for the small notebook in the drawer, the one she hadn't touched in years, with a shaky hand. She wrote day 1. "I offered them shelter. They've taken the walls." Next chapter. What happens when temporary begins to feel permanent? In the next chapter, Irene's quiet home starts changing one drawer, one decision, one insult at a time. Keep listening to see how a house full of memories becomes a battleground for respect. The next morning dawned gray and damp, as if the sky itself sensed something was off kilter. Irene stood in the kitchen, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug cream and cornflower blue, part of a set she'd received at her bridal shower nearly 40 years ago. The coffee inside had long gone cold, but she sipped it anyway, more out of ritual than need. The sound of unfamiliar footsteps echoed down the stairs. Tara entered the kitchen in a silk robe and fleece slippers, her hair twisted neatly on top of her head like a crown. Without a word, She opened the refrigerator, inspected the contents, and frowned. "Do you have almond milk?" she asked, her tone casual but clipped. "No," Irene said simply. Tara sighed, as if the absence of a single grocery item was a profound personal inconvenience. "I'll add it to the list." Irene said nothing, watching as Tara pulled out a glass and filled it with filtered water. "You know," Tara added, "I was thinking we could rearrange the living room a bit, just open up the space, maybe move that heavy cabinet with the plates. It sort of blocks the natural light." Irene set her mug down slowly. "That cabinet belonged to my mother. The light's always been fine." Tara smiled politely, but her eyes didn't soften. "Of course, I just thought we could modernize things a little while we're here. Irene felt the word land like a pin in her chest. By the afternoon, Irene returned from a short walk to find the throw pillows gone from the couch and the coffee table centerpiece replaced with a minimalist metal sculpture. A neutral gray rug had been unrolled across the living room floor, covering the faded but beloved floral pattern she'd chosen with Robert. She stepped inside, stunned. Ethan looked up from the couch. "Hey, Mom, doesn't the place look more open now?" Irene didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted across the room, her room now sterilized of color, of charm, of memory. "I didn't know we were redecorating." She said, "Oh, Tara just had a few ideas." Ethan replied, "We can put things back after we move out." The words were meant to reassure, but they felt like a promise made with fingers crossed behind his back. Irene asked quietly. He didn't seem to notice the tremor in her voice. "It's nothing permanent." Irene turned and went to the hallway closet. She opened it and saw boxes already stacked inside her board games, her winter coats, her old recipe binder, all tucked neatly away, without asking. That evening, Irene stood at the threshold of her study, except it wasn't a study anymore. A desk had been set up in the center, sleek and white, with a ring light mounted on a tripod. Tara's laptop was open beside a stack of tech gadgets, chargers, and color-coded planners. The window was cracked open, letting in the early November chill beside the desk. Irene's antique bookcase sat empty, the books now stacked in cardboard boxes near the door. Irene stepped inside slowly. Tara looked up from her laptop. "Oh, I hope it's okay that I set up in here. I need a professional background for my video meetings. The guest room has terrible lighting." Irene's voice was barely audible. "This is my study." Tara swiveled in her chair. "Well, yes, but we're only here for a little while, right? You're not still teaching or anything?" "No," Irene replied, eyes fixed on the boxes. "But I do still read." "Oh, well, we can move some of the books back when I'm done filming." Irene nodded slowly and left the room. That night, lying again in the cold guest room, Irene stared at the ceiling. A faint crack in the plaster had formed since last winter. She hadn't noticed it before. Now, she couldn't look away from it. Each small change had arrived so politely, so gently, so rationally. And yet each one carved away a little more of the home she had built, loved, and kept alive since Robert's passing. They didn't yell. They didn't push. They simply replaced. And Ethan, her son, stood by. Too busy, too tired, too willing to please. Irene rose from the bed, slipped on her robe, and tiptoed down the hallway. In the stillness of the night, she retrieved her journal from the kitchen drawer. She sat at the table, the only place left untouched, and began to write November 5th. The couch has changed. The pillows are gone. My books are in boxes. The woman in my house smiles as she takes it apart, piece by piece, nicely, neatly, quietly. Her hand hovered over the page. I think I'm starting to disappear. Lead to Chapter 3. How many small losses does it take before someone finally speaks up? In Chapter 3, a party Irene never agreed to and the moment that pushes her one step closer to reclaiming the home she's vanishing inside. Keep reading to see the quiet fire begin to rise. The house was louder than usual. Irene heard the voices before she even stepped out of her bedroom. Laughter, shrill and unfamiliar, spilled down the hallway, echoing off walls that once only knew the soft sounds of books being shelved or the ticking of her old mantel clock. She checked the time, 6:12 p.m. She hadn't been told there would be guests. She smoothed her cardigan over her blouse and stepped into the hallway. As she reached the living room, she stopped short. The dining table had been extended and draped with a sleek black runner. Wine glasses clinked. Bottles of imported sparkling water and appetizers sat on her mother's porcelain platter, used now as a serving tray for tiny salmon puffs and beetroot hummus. 4 strangers occupied her home. 2 women in blazers and 2 men in loafers, all mid-30s, stylish, corporate, completely at ease. Tara stood in the center of them, laughing as if this were her weekend getaway retreat. When Tara spotted Irene, her face didn't shift from hospitality to apology instead. She just smiled. "Oh, Irene. There you are. I assumed you'd be in bed by now." Irene blinked, her mouth gently parting. "I wasn't told we'd be having company." Tara raised an eyebrow as if the idea of notifying the homeowner were a quaint formality. "Just a little networking thing. My team's in town for a regional offsite. Super casual." Ethan, seated with a craft beer in hand, looked sheepish. "I was gonna tell you, Mom. Just slipped my mind." "Would you mind keeping the kitchen free for a bit?" Tara asked. "We're going to do some icebreaker games and I don't want anyone distracted." Irene stood there a moment longer. She looked at her living room, now sterile and curated. Her table, once used for Sunday roasts, cluttered with laughter and stories, was a stage. Even the lighting had changed. Tara had replaced her soft amber lamp bulbs with cool white LEDs. Without a word, Irene turned and walked into the laundry room. The room was dark and narrow, the hum of the dryer her only companion. She sank onto the small bench she kept beside the hamper. In her hands was the grocery bag she'd brought in 20 minutes earlier, sourdough bread, a new tin of loose-leaf tea, and a bouquet of pale yellow tulips from the farmer's market. She hadn't even unpacked it. Outside the door, laughter erupted again, loud, breezy, young. She stared at the bag for a long time, then reached inside and pulled out the tulips gently. She touched each petal, as if reassuring herself that anything was still soft in this house. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the dishwasher hummed its final rinse, Irene stood in the kitchen alone. The platter her mother had passed down was soaking in suds. She dried it with a towel, turning it slowly in her hands. There was a small chip on the underside, now slightly larger than she remembered, from the careless clink of glass against ceramic, maybe. From someone who didn't know, didn't care what it had once meant. She placed it gently back into the cabinet, behind the stacks of generic white plates Tara had bought. As she closed the door, she noticed something new, a plastic bin labeled Irene's stuff sitting under the sink. She opened it. Inside were her cookie cutters, the floral teacups from her Sunday rituals, and a Ziploc bag holding her spice jars, labeled in her late husband's handwriting. She pressed a hand against the counter to steady herself. The air felt colder now, thinner, like she didn't belong here anymore. That night, she sat at the kitchen table again, her journal open in front of her. The house was finally quiet, too quiet. Even the wind outside had given up. She dipped her pen in ink and began writing November 6th. I was a ghost in my own home tonight. I watched strangers toast wine over my memories. My voice caught in my throat, but I smiled anyway. They think silence means permission. It does not. She paused, then wrote again. Tomorrow. I will take something back, even if it's small. Something that reminds me this is still mine. Lead to Chapter 4. What happens when a woman who's been erased decides to make herself seen again? In Chapter 4, Irene's quiet world reaches a new breaking point. One locked door and one final insult. Too far. Stay with us as her quiet rebellion begins to bloom. The following morning arrived cloaked in a misty drizzle, the kind of morning that made the whole world feel quieter, more hesitant, but inside Irene's chest. Something was beginning to stir, not mist, not softness. No, this feeling had edges. She reached for the old brass key that had lived on a hook beside the pantry for decades. Her routine hadn't changed in years. Wednesday morning groceries from the co-op 2 blocks down. Some weeks she'd pick up fresh rosemary or ginger if it was on sale. Today, she wanted to bake scones, the kind Robert liked. She slipped on her rain boots, tied her scarf neatly beneath her chin, and left the house just before 8. What she didn't know was that when she returned, the lock would no longer know her. The grocery bag was heavier than usual. She cradled it against her hip with both arms, heart fluttering not from the weight, but from anticipation. She'd picked up cranberries, fresh cream, and a copy of the local paper. It felt like a small rebellion, a day to herself. Her hands smelled like thyme. She reached the front door, set the bag down, and turned the key. Nothing. She tried again. The key wouldn't budge. She frowned, wiped the key dry with her sleeve, and tried again, first gently, then with more force. Still nothing. A deep chill began to crawl up her spine. She rang the doorbell. A few moments later, Tara opened the door. She didn't look surprised to see Irene standing outside with a drenched paper bag and rain dripping from her coat sleeves. "Oh," Tara said, "you're back early." "I couldn't get the key to turn," Irene said, quietly but firmly. "Oh, right." Tara gave a small shrug. "We had the locks changed this morning." Irene blinked. "Excuse me, just for safety," Tara replied, folding her arms across her chest. "This neighborhood's getting dodgy. Ethan and I agreed it was for the best." "I have lived here for 43 years, Irene said. Her voice was still low, but now it had weight behind it. Through 3 recessions and 1 break-in, the locks were fine. "Well, it's not just about the locks," Tara said, then stepped aside to let her in. "It's about security. For everyone." Irene walked past her in silence, her wet boots squeaking against the floor. She moved like someone walking through a dream, or maybe a version of her life that was being slowly rewritten. She set the groceries down on the kitchen island. Tara was already flipping through her planner. "Oh, and just so you know, the cleaners are coming tomorrow. I had them move your sewing cabinet into the garage. It was cluttering the hallway. Hope that's okay." Irene didn't respond. That night, she stood in the garage in her robe and slippers, flashlight in hand. She found her sewing cabinet next to the recycling bin, draped in a painter's sheet like a forgotten object at an estate sale. One of the drawers was slightly open. The pink cushion her sister had made her, the one shaped like a strawberry, was crushed beneath the weight of a lamp she didn't recognize. She sat on an overturned bucket and cried, not loudly, not desperately, just tears that came without sound, the kind that slip out when the soul finally acknowledges it has been bruised one too many times. Later, inside the house, she stood in front of the mirror. Her reflection looked smaller than she remembered, tired, quiet, but not defeated. She opened the drawer to her nightstand, retrieved her journal, and sat at the edge of her bed, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. She wrote November 7th. Today they changed the locks. Tomorrow, I change something else. She closed the journal with care, then looked at the photo of Robert on her dresser, the one from their 25th anniversary in Maine. He wore that ridiculous straw hat she'd hated. He smiled like the world had already given him everything he wanted. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I waited too long." But the way she said it, it didn't sound like regret. It sounded like a promise. Lead to Chapter 5. When someone changes the locks on your life, do you knock or do you take back the key? In Chapter 5, Irene finds something hidden deep in the attic, something her daughter-in-law never expected. The quiet fire is now a spark, and sparks, left alone, become flames. The attic was colder than she remembered. Irene climbed the narrow pull-down stairs slowly, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping the wood rail. The beam of light danced across boxes and covered furniture. The scent of old pine and time-worn paper thick in the air. She hadn't been up here since last winter. Cobwebs framed the corners, dust coated everything like a second skin. She reached the top and paused, listening, downstairs. The house was still. Tara had gone to yoga. Ethan was at the office. For once. It was just Irene and the house, the real house, untouched by anyone else's hands. She moved past the plastic Christmas tree, past the trunk filled with Ethan's childhood toys, and knelt beside a wooden crate labeled Robert, personal in her late husband's handwriting. The letters were faded but still carried his essence. She ran her fingers across the lid before carefully prying it open. Inside was a stack of yellowing documents, photo envelopes, and a leather-bound journal tied with a navy ribbon. Her breath caught Robert's journal. She hadn't known he kept one. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and opened it. March 3rd, 2005. She doesn't know I'm writing this. Irene has always been the strong one. I built this house with my hands, but she turned it into a home. Every photo on the wall, every meal on the stove, every inch of warmth, it's hers. This house is hers more than it'll ever be mine. Irene pressed a hand to her mouth. She turned another page. October 12th, 2010. Just paid off the mortgage in full. Never told her. Thought it might be a good surprise for our 35th anniversary next spring. Titles in her name. Always was. She won't need anyone to tell her what to do with this place when I'm gone. Her eyes brimmed with tears. She sat on the floor, journal in her lap, surrounded by silence and insulation, and cried not from sadness, but from recognition, from being seen, from remembering who she used to be before her word was diluted by someone else's vision of modern comfort. She whispered to the rafters, "It's still mine." The next morning, Tar came home with bags from a high-end home decor store. Irene stood in the entryway, hands folded, and watched her unpack glass candle holders and minimalist planters onto her whole table. "I'm thinking of repainting this wall," Tara said. "Just a soft grage, you know. Give the space more resale value," resale Irene asked, her voice soft but direct. "Well, you know, eventually," Tara said breezily. "Ethan and I talked about it. This house is beautiful, but a little stuck in time. We'd bring it to market in no time if it had a little facelift." Irene tilted her head. "So this house, it's for sale." Tara gave a light laugh. "Not now, of course, but when the time comes. We'd love to help you transition." Irene smiled, a full, complete smile. It confused Tara. "That's very thoughtful," Irene replied. "In fact, I was thinking about making a few changes myself," Tara blinked. "Oh, some updates. Cleaning house, making plans. You know how that is." And then she turned and walked away, leaving Tara standing in the hallway with her candle holders and half-open mouth. That night, Irene sat at her old writing desk, now dragged back into her bedroom. She had vacuumed, dusted, and polished the wood until it gleamed under the glow of her reading lamp. She placed Robert's journal in the drawer alongside her own. Then she took out the title deed she had retrieved from the attic that afternoon, still sealed in a protective sleeve. Her name, Irene Wallace, typed in bold letters across the top. No co-signers. No shared ownership. Just hers. She ran her finger across the edge of the paper like it was sacred. And then, she wrote in her journal November 8th, "This house is mine, on paper, in memory, in spirit. She can take the paint and the curtains. She can take the guest room and the rugs, But the house will answer to me. I have a lawyer's appointment tomorrow, just in case. Lead to chapter 6. The title is in her name. The truth is in her hands. And now Tara is about to discover what happens when a woman stops asking permission. In chapter 6, Irene finally confronts them, and nothing is ever the same again. Don't miss the moment where silence gives way to strength. 2. The morning sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, streaking across the kitchen floor in golden angles. Irene stood by the sink, polishing the last of the teacups from the set Tara had tried to box away. She took her time, careful with each movement. The air inside the house was unusually quiet. Tara hadn't come down yet. Ethan was at work. Irene moved with purpose now, not with the hesitation of someone who doubted herself, but with the precision of someone who had made a decision. On the dining table sat a manila folder, thick and perfectly aligned, inside a copy of the title deed, legal paperwork, and notes from her meeting with a real estate attorney the day before. It was all real. The house was hers, and today, so was her voice. By mid-morning, Tara appeared, floating into the kitchen with a smoothie in hand, wearing yoga pants and a tight smile. "Oh, good," she said, barely glancing at Irene. "I wanted to ask, do you mind if I take out that old mirror in the hallway? The one with the gold trim. I found a reclaimed wood frame online that would look so much better." Irene folded her dish towel and laid it carefully on the counter. "You won't need to worry about decorating anymore." "Tara," she said, turning to face her directly. Tara blinked. "Excuse me, I've decided to sell the house." There was a pause, a thick tangible silence that seemed to stop the refrigerator's hum and still the wind outside. Tara laughed, but it was a dry, brittle sound. I don't think you understand. Irene." "You can't just I can," Irene said firmly. "And I have." She walked calmly to the dining table, picked up the folder, and opened it. One by one, she laid the documents in front of Tara: the deed, the sale preparation paperwork, the business card from the lawyer. "I'm the sole owner." Irene continued. "Robert made sure of that. He left it all in my name. No co-signers, no mortgage, no strings." Tara's face turned a shade of raw porcelain. "You're serious," she said, her voice flat, almost whispering. Irene nodded. "The agent will be here tomorrow to take pictures. You and Ethan will need to find another place by the end of the month." Tara opened her mouth, closed it again. "But we're your family. Ethan is your son. And you are guests," Irene said. "Guests who've rearranged, repainted, repurposed, and replaced everything without asking. I gave you space. You took control. This house may have room for memories, but it no longer has room for entitlement." Tara's jaw clenched. "Ethan will never agree to this." Irene looked her square in the eyes. "He won't have to." Later that evening, Ethan returned home to find Tara pacing in the foyer, livid. "She's lost it." "Ethan," she snapped, "your mother thinks she's kicking us out. She's selling the house." Ethan turned to Irene, who was calmly placing a cup of tea on the coffee table in the living room. "Mom," he said, voice tight, "is that true?" Irene didn't rise. She simply nodded. "It's time." Ethan sighed, raking a hand through his hair. This is a bit extreme, don't you think?" "What's extreme?" Irene said softly. "Is being locked out of my own house. What's extreme is having my life rearranged without conversation. What's extreme is watching the home I built become someone else's project." Ethan looked torn, his gaze darting between his wife and his mother. But Irene didn't flinch. "Not this time." "You raised me here," he said. "I never thought I'd have to say goodbye like this." "You already did," Irene replied gently. "You just didn't notice." That night, Irene sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, her tea cooling beside her. The house felt quieter again. Not the suffocating quiet of being erased, but the kind that follows a storm. The kind that brings clarity. She stared at the mantel, at the photo of her and Robert in Maine, at peace in the sunlight. She imagined him standing beside her now, nodding, saying, "You did good. Rini, you found your way back." She opened her journal and wrote November 9th today. "I took back what was mine, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because I remembered who I was before I let their voices drown out my own. I found her again, and she is stronger than I ever knew." She closed the book, smiled. Lead to Chapter 7. With the deed in her hand and her dignity restored, Irene now faces a new horizon freedom. In Chapter 7, she begins building her next life, one where her voice is the only one she needs to hear. Don't miss what happens when a woman reclaims not just her house but herself. The real estate agent arrived at 9:00 a.m. sharp. He was young, polite, and a little too enthusiastic for Irene's taste, but he respected the silence in the house, the way she walked him through each room like she was showing him something sacred. "This home has good bones," he said, adjusting his camera lens. "Character. You can feel the years in the walls, but in a good way." Irene smiled softly. "The years in this house aren't just in the walls, they're in the quiet, in the worn corners of the stairs, in the way the front door sticks unless you nudge it just right." He chuckled, noting it down. "That'll be a selling point for the right buyer." She nodded but said nothing. This wasn't just a sale. It was a passing of the torch, one done on her terms, at her pace, with her name on every dotted line. By mid-afternoon, Ethan had packed 2 boxes and was helping Tara roll up her standing desk cables. Their things no longer bled into every room. Irene watched them with quiet detachment. Not cruel, but clean. Tara avoided her gaze. Ethan approached her one last time before leaving. "I'm sorry." "Mom," he said, voice low, "I let things get away from me. From us." Irene looked at her son and saw not the boy she raised, but the man he had become good-hearted, tired, and deeply unaware of the cost women like her had paid so that men like him could move freely through life. "I know," she said, "but you'll learn." He hugged her tighter than usual and whispered, "You really are stronger than both of us combined." She didn't answer, but her arms around him said what words could not. 2 weeks later, the house was officially listed. Irene had already signed the papers, transferred utilities, and picked her closing date. But the real transformation came not in documents, but in decisions. She had chosen a quiet apartment by the lake, not large, not grand, but filled with morning light and a small balcony that overlooked a park where children laughed and older couples walked hand in hand. The kind of place that asked for nothing and offered everything in return: peace, space, and possibility. Her first morning there, she unpacked the essentials: her tea kettle, Robert's journal, a framed photo of her wedding day, and her favorite mug with the tiny crack in the handle. She set them on the windowsill. The air was light, uncomplicated. She stepped out onto the balcony with a cup of chamomile and breathed. It was the first time in years that no one needed anything from her. No errands, no permissions, no explanations, just morning birds and the breeze. That weekend, she pinned a flyer on the apartment building's corkboard in the lobby: Wednesday mornings, women's book circle, no experience needed, tea included, hosted by Irene Wallace, Apt 3B, by Wednesday. 6 women showed up, some in sweats, some in Sunday best, one in a bathrobe. They brought scones, mismatched mugs, and stories. They talked about Little Women and the Secret Garden, but also about broken marriages, adult children who forgot to call, and the joy of sleeping in without guilt. Irene listened. She spoke. She laughed, and somewhere between page 35 and a shared memory about first crushes, she realized she had found her people, not because she'd been assigned to them, but because she had invited them in. That night, Irene sat in her reading chair, legs tucked beneath her, as the sun dipped behind the trees. She opened her journal and wrote November 22nd. Today I laughed until my sides hurt. In my own space, with my own friends. I didn't have to ask for a room or justify my voice. I simply belonged. I may have sold a house, but I gained something far more precious myself. She paused, then underlined the last word twice. Myself. Lead to Chapter 8. New apartment. New friendships. A heart reborn. In Chapter 8, Irene reflects on her journey and what it truly means to choose joy, peace, and belonging over obligation. Her story may have started with loss, but what comes next is a testament to the quiet power of reclaiming your own name. It had been 3 weeks since Irene handed over the keys to the house she once believed she would die in. And yet, she was more alive now than she had been in years. The lake outside her new window shimmered beneath the morning sun. Ducks skimmed across the water, and children's laughter carried faintly from the nearby playground. There was no antique grandfather clock ticking in the background, no microwave humming, no conversations overheard through walls about resale value or outdated fixtures. Just the hum of life, the kind that asked nothing of her but presence. Irene stood in the doorway of her apartment's small kitchen, watching the kettle begin to rattle. She wore a soft cardigan and slippers, hair loosely pinned, no makeup, no hosting smile, just herself. She poured hot water over chamomile and lemon slices. Watching the steam rise, it curled upward, like the breath of something sacred, something reborn. At 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. 2 of the women from her book circle arrived first: Denise, a retired travel agent with an infectious laugh, and Pearl, who wore oversized earrings shaped like sunflowers. "You look radiant," Pearl said, handing Irene a tin of shortbread cookies. "It's the tea," Irene joked, ushering them inside. Soon, 3 more women joined, and the living room buzzed with energy, not loud, not chaotic, but warm. It pulsed with authenticity. The bookshelf by the window now held titles like Women Who Run with the Wolves, Beloved, and The Joy Luck Club. Each spine was a mirror of some inner piece of her now reawakened. "Let's read the last chapter aloud," Irene suggested, opening their current book. "But before that, I want to ask everyone a question." The women leaned in. "What does home mean to you? Not the walls, not the address, the feeling?" Denise answered first. "It's the place where I'm not afraid to cry." Pearl nodded. "Where I can laugh at the wrong time and no one makes me feel small." Marjorie, the quietest of the group, looked down at her mug. "Where I'm not invisible." Irene smiled, her eyes moist. "Then I think we've all found it," she whispered. Later that evening, after the last laugh faded and the dishes were washed, Irene sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, the moon silvering the lake. The wind carried a hint of pine from the park trees, and for the first time in months, the silence felt complete, not empty. She thought about Robert, about the house, about the moment she stood in her own hallway and realized she no longer needed anyone's permission to be who she was. She thought about Ethan. He had called last week, just to talk. No requests, no guilt, just his voice saying, "Mom, I get it now. I really do. You taught me more than you know." She had thanked him, told him she loved him. And for once, it didn't feel like a mother reassuring a son. It felt like 2 adults meeting in the middle. She opened her journal, the lamplight soft beside her, and began to write December 2nd. The old life was full of duty, tradition, sacrifice. But the new life, it's full of choice. I choose stillness. I choose sunlight. I choose the women who see me. I choose me, and I am enough. She closed the journal slowly, sipped her tea, and watched the horizon stretch out, soft and endless before her. Lead to final chapter. The end. After decades of sacrifice and silence, Irene has found something rare: peace in the final chapter. She reflects on the woman she became and leaves us with a message every woman deserves to hear. Don't miss the heartfelt ending to this powerful journey of reclaiming worth, voice, and self. Winter arrived gently in the lakeside town. Snow fell like whispers, dusting the rooftops and park benches in soft white lace. Irene watched from her window as the world turned still, the lake frozen at its edges, the trees bare but standing tall. She no longer dreaded silence. In fact, she had come to love it because this silence wasn't empty. It was earned. It had been nearly 2 months since she left her old house behind. At first, she thought the ache in her chest was grief, but as the days passed, she realized it was something else entirely. It was a release, not just from walls and furniture, but from years of trying to shrink herself for the sake of peace. She didn't have to be easy to live with anymore. She didn't have to go along with it or let the young people take over. She could simply leave. One Sunday afternoon, she stood on the pier just beyond the park, bundled in her coat, scarf tucked tight around her chin. The air smelled of pine and frost. Her cheeks were rosy from the wind, and her gloved hands held a thermos of hot cider. A little girl walked past, holding her father's hand, and pointed at the frozen lake. "Look, Daddy, the water's sleeping." Irene smiled. She remembered Ethan at that age, his cheeks puffed with cold, his gloves always on the wrong hands. She remembered the feel of his small fingers wrapped around hers, and then, with a quiet certainty, she forgave him. Not because he asked, but because holding on to resentment would only take up space she was finally learning to fill with joy. Back at home, she opened her journal for the last time. The pages were nearly full now, lines and entries chronicling her unraveling, her reclaiming, and her return. She wrote December 18th. "I've learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say enough. Enough silence, enough shrinking, enough waiting for someone else to notice you matter. You don't need to fight with fists to reclaim your life. Sometimes, all it takes is a quiet walk to the attic, a name on a deed, and the courage to say, 'This is mine.' And if you're reading this, wondering if it's too late to take your life back, let me be the one to tell you it's not. You are not too old, too tired, too soft. You are not invisible. You are still here, and that means your story is still yours to write." She closed the journal, this time, not as a habit, but as a ceremony. She placed it on the shelf beside Robert's and smiled. That evening, the women from her book circle gathered one last time before the new year. They toasted with cider, passed around ginger cookies, and shared what they hoped to leave behind and what they wanted to carry forward. When it was Irene's turn, she stood and simply said, "I want to carry forward myself." There were tears, hugs, laughter, and when the last guest left, and the apartment was once again quiet, Irene stood by the window and watched the stars appear, one by one, each one a spark, each one a reminder that even in winter, light returns, always. Final message to the audience. If this story touched something in you, don't let it stay a story. Let it be a mirror, a spark, a quiet nudge that says, you can begin again, right where you are. Leave a comment below and share your story, or someone you know who found their voice after being silenced, because sometimes sharing the truth is the first step back to yourself. This was Irene's story, but it might just be yours too.